Hi everyone, welcome to season 2 of Grustlers, where we bring you stories from the trenches, from folks who've done risk and compliance and security across multiple stages, across multiple situations, and we try to keep it very real. We try to go deep into their experiences, their journeys, and exchange notes here. So today we have a very interesting guest here. We have Kevin, who spent a career working at security in tech startups. And Kevin and I have a lot in common because Kevin made the transition from working at a big four consulting firm, working with very large enterprises, and then transitioned to working in smaller situations, working with tech startups, small and medium sized. So would be an interesting conversation. Would be good to understand your journey, Kevin. So I think let's start with understanding what your career has shaped up like. I mean, what made you transition from big four consulting to small startups? What prompted you to make that transition?
Yeah, it's a good question, and thank you for having me. And so, started off my career in Big Four, was in college, studied engineering, didn't know what I wanted to do, and so consulting seemed like a very easy, hey, you can just join this company and figure this out later. I was placed in the security group. It was a high growth area at the time, still is. And I guess compared to my software engineering internships, it wasn't very technical. A lot of the focus was on meetings, slides, organizing things, and it made me realize that with an engineering background, I prefer to be a little more hands-on, actually build systems, things like that. And even though I really enjoyed building all the PowerPoints, and to this day I still use those skills, I enjoy working with computers in a more hands-on way. And so decided to break into the tech world where there's a lot more new technology, it's opportunity to write software and do a little more interesting things and to also have a bigger impact. So when you're a consultant at a big four, you're kind of a very small piece of a really big machine. And so your impact, in my opinion, is fairly limited. But if you join a startup and you're an early security hire, there's a lot you can do relative to the business and things like that. So startups I've worked in kind of varied. So some were in e-commerce, some were B2B SaaS, some were non-e-commerce B2C. I've also consulted for and worked at a security vendor. So I've also been on that side. I know some of our listeners, y'all hate vendors, but I've been there and, cut your vendor some slack. It's a very stressful thing to do. And yeah, and I think that for me personally, being on the tech side of things, I find it infinitely more interesting. Like I was a software engineer, like in a past life, and so security engineering is a kind of like a perfect blend of risk management, but also technical work.
And Ken, one of the things that came up in our earlier conversation was that you actually utilized your bench time during your consulting days to ramp up on skills that you felt were relevant for a career in security engineering. Could you talk more about that? What kind of resources did you tap into? How did you sort of boil the ocean and narrow down on what was going to be relevant for you?
Yeah, good question. So in Big Four consulting, the CISSP is kind of this standard that everyone strives to reach towards. So sure enough, I never got my CISSP, but during my bench time in between projects, I read the entire Sean Harris book. I wanted to kind of get that breadth of knowledge because any sort of consulting project, you're working on something really small, and I just wanted to, as a new security person, know a little bit of everything. And so that's why I think I eventually wanted to join these small security teams where you touch everything. Also did a lot of labs. So there's resources like Vuln Hub where you can download VMs that were designed to purposely have vulnerabilities. I read this book called Security Engineering. It's by a Cambridge professor. I believe he actually just passed, but he released the entire book for free online. I thought that was really cool. And yeah, so it was a lot of these free resources. I mean, the CISSP book was maybe like $30, and I honestly thought I learned more from kind of doing all that self-study than my actual projects. Whereas my projects, I learned a lot about how businesses operate, how people interact, but I honestly learned very little security from PwC. A lot of it was just on my own.
Got it. So when you actually made the transition from advisory or consulting work for very large enterprises to working in a small to medium company context, what were some of the curveballs that you hadn't anticipated? What areas or what things turned out to be harder than or a lot harder than you anticipated?
Yeah, good question. So when you're working at a Big Four or any sort of large Fortune 500, typically security has already been in place and had been in place for a very long time. And so things like you don't have local admin on your laptop, you have to have IT approval to install something, or there's enterprise grade SIM tools and IDS tools, and there's entire teams that focus just on one thing. But when you're at a startup, especially if you're the first person, as I've been several times, a lot of times you're kind of the subject matter expert. There's no one to really turn to if you run into an issue. And so you kind of have to adapt and learn a little bit of everything. And so a big company, let's say they're working with Azure, there's probably a bunch of people at the company who know about Azure security groups and things like that. Whereas you join a startup and you haven't used Azure, you're doing a lot of Googling. Maybe you're doing some kind of coursework after work. And what ends up happening is if there is an issue, people just rely on you to solve it end to end, and you don't necessarily have a backup. And so it forces you to really learn things very quickly. And with that being said, since you do have to deal with so many different areas, you probably don't get the very narrow expertise compared to, let's say, if you were an application security engineer at a very large org, you're probably going to know a lot about application security and vulnerabilities and things like that. Whereas if you are a first security hire at a B2B SaaS org, your focus in the beginning is probably getting your company through SOC 2. And you're not really touching AppSec all that much, other than some high level things like let's get a pen test, let's update our JavaScript dependencies. You're probably not teaching developers like, hey, this specific line should be written this way. You just don't have that time, and it's okay because your kind of requirements and the business needs are a little different, right?
And this is probably an important question for people looking to make career transitions, as a lot of our viewers are. Uh, Junior to mid-level professionals at large companies looking to transition to smaller companies where they get more agency. But the converse is also true, where people are looking to transition to larger companies to focus deeper into one problem area. And I think it's important for people to sort of strike the right balance and know what they're getting into. So this perspective is actually quite helpful. But that brings me to a follow-up question, Kevin. When we are talking about, and there are two contrasting things here, right? So on one end you have, I mean, every area within security having its own dedicated team in a large enterprise. There's sufficient degree of depth, whether you talk about app security, whether you talk about offensive security, whether you talk about fraud detection. All of these become areas which are self-sustaining, which have their own dedicated functions in a very large enterprise context. But you talked about covering breadth in a small to medium sized companies, but not necessarily going overly deep into any of these areas to the point that it becomes an overkill, right? As mid-sized companies try to create a security program or a GRC program like that, the one that you just alluded to, where should they get started? How do they establish what is the right level of depth? I mean, the combination of depth and breadth, because you can't strengthen one area at the cost of the other. You'll leave yourself vulnerable, right? So, how should companies start thinking about building a GRC program in a mid-market context that covers sufficient breadth, as you just mentioned? Yeah.
It's a good question. So what I'm going to say is probably going to be an unpopular answer with some folks, but I think that if you're a B2B org, having some sort of compliance framework to drive you is a very good way to think about it. So everyone says, oh, like compliance isn't security, but if you're a B2B org, you want to sell to the larger enterprises, SOC 2 or ISO 27001 is going to be something you have to do anyway. And if you think about all these compliance frameworks, a lot of them have these overlapping controls. And I don't think anyone can really say like, oh, if you implement things and get a SOC 2 audit, anything you did was bad, right? Like basic things such as your users should have MFA, you should have some basic vendor review process. These are all really good foundational steps. And having that, like a compliance framework as a guideline, also helps people that aren't security folks to at least have a starting point, right? Like us, I know a lot of listeners, we are all security people. We have all this domain expertise, but imagine you're a startup founder, maybe you're a software engineer, you had some experience talking to your security team, but you never worked on those projects yourself. It's not very realistic for you to know how to do everything best practice wise. And it's probably easier for you to go, okay, I want to sell to JP Morgan. They want me to do a SOC 2. All right, the SOC 2 is going to have me do these 10 big things. I think that's a very good starting point. It doesn't mean you stop there, but compared to 10 years ago, where companies weren't all getting SOC 2 reports and things like that, this allows folks to at least have a much better foundation than just having credit cards stored in plain text and things like that. Yeah.
Provoke you a bit here and provide a counter thought to that. So, we do hear a lot of people saying that compliance doesn't equal security, compliance doesn't equal risk management. So compliance is compliance and security is security. Uh, where do you think? And but if you look at any standard framework like a SOC 2 or an ISO 27000 or an S800, right? Uh, all of them do give you a fair set of guidelines in terms of how you should establish a security practice. In fact, not only that, they allow a fair degree of flexibility for you to contextualize. The ISO 27001 allows you to build a statement of applicability, and the SOC 2 also gives you enough flexibility to determine controls that are most relevant for your environment, right? Where do you think the ball drops? Uh, what do you think is the origin of uh, this notion that compliance is very disconnected from security? It doesn't equal security. Is it poor execution? Is it perfunctory execution? What do you think is the problem there?
Yeah, I think part of it is people, when they get their audits, the folks doing the audits aren't necessarily engineers by trade, right? A lot of them are accountants, they're following rules. And so for them, it's a kind of like a very black and white. And a lot of times people will try to talk to their auditors and try to explain things. It doesn't always go through. And also, there are certain standards of a SOC 2 that maybe don't cover everything, right? So, like these days, passwordless is this new thing that a lot of people are trying to push. And so, the fewer passwords you have, the more you're relying on like FIDO2 and YubiKeys and things like that. It actually improves your security a lot, but stuff like this doesn't always show up in a compliance standard. And what also doesn't help is sometimes you hear these breaches in the news and X company probably got their SOC 2 report, and there's a lot of discourse going. They got a bogus SOC 2 report, or they descoped it so that it didn't actually check anything. And I think everyone has to realize that if it wasn't for SOC 2, those companies probably would be in even worse shape, right? And for most companies, security isn't the primary driver of the business. End of the day, the business needs to make money, and every company has to make a decision. Like, we want to implement security, but if there's a lot of investment involved, or if it slows us down too much, we're not going to be able to sell. We're not going to be able to serve our users. And I think, again, it's like I tell everybody you should be a vendor at some point. You start to think about these things. And if you kind of overinvest into security as a security practitioner, it may be too much, and there's probably better time spent for the company doing other things like building features and things like that. Um, and I don't think anybody thinks that a SOC 2 is going to end all be all, but I don't think anybody would disagree that if it weren't for these SOC 2 or PCI, that the world would be in like a better place, right? Like, I don't think us requiring merchants to have to go through a PCI is a bad thing. Otherwise, they would take our credit cards and do who knows what with them, right? That's why PCI started. So yeah, it is kind of like a circular chicken and the egg kind of way of thinking, but I think compliance is necessary. And think about like driving. Imagine if we didn't have to get our driver's licenses and we just allowed people to drive, things would be really bad. Even if you think that the driver you saw this morning was an idiot, right? We have to start somewhere.
Choosing a driving like the okay, so a driving license doesn't necessarily guarantee that the person is a great driver. Yeah, but they've at least done something right too.
Yeah, imagine if you had a driver who didn't know what a stop sign was. Maybe they'll just barrel through and hit somebody. So you have to have some sort of baseline to get anywhere.
Okay, and if I had to sort of, coming back to your earlier point around having a pragmatic, breadth first kind of a GRC program for mid market companies, if I have to, if I have to ask you to pick you 4 or 5 areas that you think are bare essentials where companies could get started, what would they be? Which are your favorite ones?
Sure. So TPRM, third-party risk management, is a fun topic for a lot of people. And I think given how a lot of these early stage startups, especially many that I've been, you buy a lot of these SaaS tools. You're not doing a lot of self-hosting. You're not doing a lot of in-house writing of some of these side things. Like, no TypeScript developer is going to write everything from scratch. And so to kind of think about the best way to handle TPRM, you're a small company. I don't think anyone expects you to do a full end-to-end review of any of your vendors. First of all, you probably don't have time. Second of all, you probably don't have the expertise. Third of all, let's say you go to AWS and you say, AWS, fill out this questionnaire for me. They're not going to respond to you. They're just going to say either use our product or don't. And I think a really good starting point, before you even think about risk or anything, is just list all the vendors you currently have. Because the worst thing that could happen is some vendor has some breach, and you see that in the news, and you're like, okay, whatever. And then you find out down the line, so-and-so on your team actually used that and put information there. Like, that is a very bad scenario where, like, that is way worse than thinking about how deep should I go with my vendors. If you don't know who your vendors are, you're in a much worse place than if you have a like an immature program and you're doing kind of just let me look at a SOC 2, right? Like think about some imagine if you're like at some company and you used SolarWinds all those years ago. Imagine you're on security team and you didn't know your company used SolarWinds. It would be a very bad surprise if you woke up and found out, oh, I have to do this incident response now because I didn't even know we have this vendor, right? And so as you're starting out, you're not using that many tools. Make it a good habit of just documenting. I use Gmail, I use GCP, I use Salesforce. The earlier you do that, the better you'll be. And
Where should accountabilities lie? Because I know it. I mean, there's no point in introducing unnecessary bureaucracy in small to medium-sized companies, but uh, there is going to be someone who's responsible for assessing a vendor, and someone needs to sign off. This is okay. This vendor is risky, but I still go ahead and onboard this vendor because of I need them for the business to run smoothly, right? So, or they're business critical vendors. Uh, and in some cases, they would just live with the risk and say, okay, look, these are 5 items that the vendor should mitigate, but we need them now. So we'll create tasks for them and they can mitigate them before the next assessment cycle, right? So how do you think accountability should be established?
yeah, I think probably early on, like security is very engineering oriented, right? And a lot of the SaaS tools you're using, they're going to integrate with your app, and so probably like your CTO or your senior engineering leader should kind of be the first one to think, okay, we're using all these tools, it's connected to our databases, because they're the ones who know how data flows. They should probably be the ones that set the example and say, here's our stack, here are the things we use. Um, I would say the CTO in general probably ends up being the de facto security person anyway. So it makes a lot of sense for that person to take the charge there.
Got it. Got it. Okay. Great. What's the next area for you?
Sure, yeah. Access management is always a fun thing. So I know when people are starting out, let's say you're a 2 or 3 person team, everybody has access to everything. Makes sense. But I think once you probably start getting around the 10 person like stage, you should probably start thinking about, hey, our CEO doesn't even write code anymore. They don't log into AWS. We should probably start removing access. And kind of a side effect is if you're a small company, you don't have a lot of funding. If you start removing users from platforms that they don't use, you're also saving money, right? SaaS tools make money through subscriptions and things like that. And I would say the shared accounts are a really big problem with startups, and you should probably avoid them as much as possible. Or if you do, put them in something like 1Password where the 2FA code can be shared. It really is a good practice to have everyone have individual accounts unless something is prohibitively expensive. It's one of those things that, even from a non-security perspective, if one person changes the password for a shared account, half the time they forget to update it, forget to tell people. Then you're on vacation, you're dealing with an incident, you can't log into the shared account because you didn't follow these practices. It just ends up being a mess, and you don't think it's a problem until it is.
Somewhat of a miniature version of what an enterprise implementation of the principle of least privilege would look like. Some very basic hygiene practices.
Yeah, like you don't need to buy Okta and or CyberArk or anything like that, but just give everybody their own account. Have everybody have an email with their name at company.com. That'll save you a lot of headaches down the line.
Not xyz at company.com, which is a shared ID with super admin access across the entire infra. So,
Like what could go wrong there, especially if you don't have a password manager?
okay, great. So TPRM, access management. What's the third?
Yeah, like one other thing that really kills companies down the line is some sort of vulnerability management. And I'm not talking about installing like Nessus or Tenable.io everywhere, but JavaScript dependencies, especially when you're kind of like a small company, your app isn't super complicated. Just make it a habit of maybe like once every month, or if you want to, once every quarter, just update your JavaScript dependencies. If you're using GitHub, just have Dependabot inform you when things need to be updated, especially if they're very minor versions. Almost always, it's not going to break anything. Like major versions, you do need to talk about, but it's one of those things where when it does come time for you to do a SOC 2 and you establish some sort of SLA, like we need to resolve all vulnerabilities in 30 days. If you have things that are 2 or 3 years old, you're going to require a major update. That's going to be very painful down the line. And so make it a habit of you don't have to obsess over Dependabot, but just set some sort of cadence, have things updated, because otherwise the tech debt is going to explode once you get a little bigger and once your app is more complex. So,
Got it. Makes sense. What's the next one?
all right, yeah, I think cloud security is kind of this taboo topic where everyone says, "Ooh, like there's all these vendors that help you secure the cloud. And I think when you're first starting out, you don't need to invest in something like Wiz, which is very comprehensive. Just use your cloud provider's basic tools. Like if you're using Azure, even the non-paid version of Security Center will tell you things like you have RDP open on your server. You don't need to be a security expert to follow these recommendations. It's very small. They usually even tell you, here's a link, here's what to fix. And if you kind of make a good habit of following those, then down the line, you don't have to hire a security person who comes in and goes, wow, this is a big mess, right? Like this is very different than like implementing DLP and doing anything crazy. It's just very simple things like close your security groups, right? Your user doesn't have an MFA. And if you're just like even a junior engineer, it's fairly easy for someone to understand stuff like this, right? And it doesn't cost you a whole lot of money with the built-in config checks.
Got it. One of the areas that would love to pick your brain on is risk management, and that takes various flavors across organizations. And in fact, not just the tools or techniques used to record risk, but also the way organizations perceive risks. There are companies that would consider point-in-time vulnerabilities as risks. They were or misconfigurations as risks. But there are companies that would take any finding which is sustained over a period of time as a risk and then assign an impact and a probability to it, right? Some companies would like to follow an asset-based or a threat-based model. Some companies would like to follow the NIST RMF or the ISO 31000. So there's a wide variety of techniques and tools and approaches that companies use to record risks, right? And when you look at a large enterprise, it's a very nuanced academic kind of a setup. But if you're talking about a mid-market company that likely doesn't yet have a risk management program in place, where do you think they can get started, and what are the pitfalls they should avoid without making it overly complicated and cumbersome?
Yeah, I think some of the pitfalls are sometimes like I think I was just speaking to someone. They did a tabletop incident response exercise for the first time, and for 2 hours they were just talking about what would happen if we had a rogue employee release information on the internet. And I think for a company just starting out, going kind of too deep is probably overkill because what you should probably start with is just like go back to what the company's mission is, right? Like all of your risks are related to that. And so if your company's mission is you want to sell the software and make money, you should start thinking of ways, what are things that would prevent us from making money? And so these aren't even necessarily security things, right? It could just be risks like we don't make the features that our customers want, or we choose a cloud provider that isn't very available and we have a lot of downtime. And I don't think you have to be a security expert to think about risk. It's just stuff like, oh yeah, I heard that Okta got breached. Even just think like, hey, what if we got breached? How bad would it be? Like, as a small company, you probably can't absorb it as well as a large one. And so you might think like, okay, like as a small company, we're working with healthcare data. People don't really know who we are yet. If we had some news article about it saying PHI was exposed from our company, it's probably really bad for us. Whereas like a large company like Epic Systems, they could probably ride it out. And so then from there, you can think, okay, I'm not a security expert, but is there something I can do to maybe make that less of a problem? You might think, I'm going to start to lock down some of my controls to reduce accidents, or I'm going to buy cyber insurance, which is a very cost-effective way to at least buy yourself some sort of security. And if anything, for a small company, you probably shouldn't use these big frameworks because you might not understand it, might be overkill. Just think to yourself, like, you know your company best. What are things that could happen that would disrupt your mission, which is usually to serve a product and make money and things like that. Like, I can talk about SafeBase, right? Like our mission was to allow our customers to have trust centers. And so we were thinking of risks such as what are things that would disrupt that ability, right? Like if we had our GCP like access tokens in GitHub, that would be bad because people could come in, they could like mess with our instances and things like that. And so when you kind of tie it back to that, you start realizing risk is not like a security expertise type of thing. It's just, do you know your business enough, and can you think of things that can go wrong, right?
Okay, so what I'll do for the benefit of the viewers, Kevin, is that let me summarize what we discussed. The 5 broad areas that turned out to be your favorite picks when we're establishing a GRC program in the context of mid-market companies. You spoke about third-party risk management, and at the bare minimum, knowing who your vendors are, who your third parties are, be it tools and applications, be it software, be it individuals, or be it companies, and at least establishing a hierarchy of how we manage or measure risks against them. What are the right questions to ask at least? Then we spoke about access management, where we talked about how organizations evolve from being 10 people companies to potentially 100, 150, 500 people companies, and the right delegation of authority or access or privilege needs to happen. But a version, while the implementation for the principle of least privilege doesn't have to be as complicated or as cumbersome as a large enterprise, but some hygiene practices around whether they're common IDs, whether security groups are configured correctly or not, whether external IDs have super admin access or not, whether the CEO has delegated authority to the right person in the company or not. Those practices will still need to be established, and that's a good starting point perhaps. Then we spoke about vulnerability management and patching, and we talked about while we don't need very complicated tools for mid-market companies, but it's still important to have patching done at a good enough frequency and done consistently, at a frequency which is pragmatic, but also done consistently with somebody being accountable for it. Then we spoke about cloud controls. While mid-market companies may not have the budget or an appetite or even the requirement, frankly, for an enterprise-grade CNAP tool, for example, but establishing basic cloud controls in a continuous manner, especially as an environment grows from maybe 50 EC2 instances to 500 EC2 instances between two successive SOC 2 audits, is important, and therefore hygiene, observability, and monitoring is important. And finally, we spoke about risk management, where we said that companies need to think beyond looking at a set of templatized questions against which they record their responses for the auditor's consumption, and some bit of contextualization in their risk assessment needs to be carried out, even if it is not a formal BIE exercise or a tabletop exercise, but some bit of contextualization that captures the nuance around their organization needs to be present for the risk assessment to be meaningful. It doesn't have to correspond to industry best frameworks. It doesn't have to involve very sophisticated enterprise grade ERM tools, but some bare minimum contextualization is important to get started. And I think these are your 5 favorite picks, which will probably would be helpful for the viewers, especially as a lot of our viewers will likely start setting up a GRC program for their companies. That actually brings us to the end of this episode. Kevin, thanks a lot for your time. It's been great. Any closing remarks for our viewers?
Yeah, I can say if you're looking to join a startup as a first security hire, it will be a very rewarding experience. But remember, I think the key of this conversation is you may be a security person, but those around you are not, and just cut folks a little slack and use it as an opportunity to educate them, and if anything, learn from them too, because there's more that goes on at a company than security. So yeah, thank you, Ayush, for having me. This was a really good conversation.
And that's amazing amount of empathy and commercial mindset that you've demonstrated throughout the conversation, that ultimately the business exists to make money. The business doesn't exist to remain secure and head towards nothing. So a pragmatic middle ground is important, but again, that needs to be complemented with the right degree of communication between the security teams and the rest of the business folks, so that everybody develops a baseline appreciation for why those practices need to exist in the first place. So it's been great talking to you, Kevin. Thanks for taking the time. See you.